I'm Beth Brumer Reeve, Marketing Specialist at Signature Books. A few months after joining Signature Books, I recognized that a few of my colleagues were in the process of writing or finishing a book project. Their books are so interesting, and I thought our podcast listeners would love to hear from them. Join me in this episode as I have a conversation with Director of Signature Books, Barbara Jones-Brown, Editor John Hatch, and Marketing Manager Devery Anderson. Barbara Jones-Brown is the director of Signature Books. Previously, she was the executive director of the Mormon History Association, historical director of Better Days 2020, and content editor of the award-winning Massacre at Mountain Meadows, which came out in 2008. She is co-author of the book sequel, Vengeance is Mine, The Mountain Meadows Massacre and Its Aftermath, which comes out this May 2023. Brown earned a master's degree in American history from the University of Utah and a bachelor's degree in journalism and English from Brigham Young University. Besides her family, her passions in life include skiing, any sport in the ocean, and yes, archival research. John Hatch is an editor for Signature Books. He is the author of several articles and the editor of Danish Apostle, The Diaries of Anthony H. Lund. His book, What Do You Mean, Murder? Clue and the Making of a Cult Classic, will be out on November 7th, 2023. He lives in Salt Lake City with his wife, Joy, and they are the parents of 5 children. Devery Anderson is the editor or co-editor of 4 books related to Mormons and the West. His book, Emmett Till, The Murder That Shocked the World and Propelled the Civil Rights Movement, was published by the University Press of Mississippi in 2015 and was optioned that same year by Hollywood producers and is the basis for the recent 6.5-hour ABC TV series, Women of the Movement, which premiered on January 6, 2022, and then streamed on Hulu. His new book, A Slow Calculated Lynching, The Story of Clyde Kennard, published in March of 2023, was also published by the University Press of Mississippi in the spring of 2023. He is the marketing manager for Signature Books, a scholarly publishing house in Salt Lake City, and is the father of 3 children and the grandfather of 2. So that's a mouthful. You guys have a lot of experience between the 3 of you. For our listeners, let's start with Barbara, and then I'll go to John and then Devery. Let's tell everyone a little bit about your book, and start with the title, and then a synopsis of your book, and also maybe you could say how long it took you to write your book. I'll start with you, Barbara.
Sure. Thank you, Beth, for those introductions. It's an honor to be on this podcast with you and John and Devery today. So the Mountain Meadows Massacre occurred in September of 1857 when a group of California-bound immigrants were attacked and later slaughtered by a group of Mormon militiamen. And it was a controversial story that still continues to be controversial today and evokes quite a bit of interest even to today. The first book on this subject, Massacre at Mountain Meadows, came out in 2008. I was the content editor for that, and I was hired in 2006 to edit that book. Following that book, I loved editing history so much, I was inspired to go on and get a master's degree. And then one of the authors of Massacre at Mountain Meadows invited me to be his co-author, Richard E. Turley Jr. And so together we wrote the sequel to the first book called Vengeance is Mine. We've been working on that for 14 years, so we are so excited that that is finally coming out. But basically, Volume 2 picks up where the first book ended on September 11th, 1857, and goes all the way through the execution of one of its perpetrators, John D. Lee, and the death of Brigham Young in 1877.
Great. Okay, John, would you tell us about your book?
Sure. It's quite a jump from Mountain Meadows Massacre to a goofy movie made in 1985. I saw this movie Clue when I was 9 years old, and I fell in love with it because it is a silly movie. And it's the kind of thing that kids really like. I've always loved it, and I decided, I had questions about it, but because it flopped when it originally came out, there's really nothing about it. There's very little information, but it's since become a really beloved movie. And so I decided that I was going to go out and write about this film. I've written on movies before and have some background in film history. And so I thought, well, if nobody's done this, I'll be the one to do it. And so this is about the making of the movie Clue that came out in 1985.
And John, if I remember right, because I remember seeing that at the theater, did that have three different endings that you
It
could
did,
go and
yeah. Yeah,
I
in
just
theater, in bigger markets, they would advertise in the newspaper, they would say you could go see ending A or ending B or ending C. And now all three endings are on the home video version, but it was seen as this novelty at the time, and Paramount was convinced they were going to get a lot of people there. And what happened is it was so confusing that nobody went and saw it instead.
kind of backfired. Oh,
Yeah.
well, thank you. Okay, Devery, we'll go to you next.
All right. And my book is called A Slow, Calculated Lynching, Story of Clyde Kennard. And it just came out last month. And this book is about Clyde Kennard is not a super well-known figure. A lot of people who study the civil rights movement know about him. People in Hattiesburg, Mississippi know about him because there's a highway named after him and a building on the campus of the University of Southern Mississippi named after him. But he's not really well known. The book is called A Slow, Calculated Lynching because the state basically took his life from him. He tried to integrate the university there in Hattiesburg in the late 50s and early 60s. And because at that point, the Brown versus Board of Education decision had already been handed down by the U.S. Supreme Court. And so legally, they couldn't keep him out of the school based on his race. But Mississippi was slow to ever allow integration to happen. And so they found other ways to keep him out. And they resorted to two extremes finally, and both times was to frame him for crimes he didn't commit. The second time they framed him, he ended up with a sentence of 7 years in the state penitentiary doing hard labor at Parchman Farm. And he developed colon cancer while he was in prison. He didn't get the help that he really needed, and so his condition worsened, and he wasn't allowed to go to the doctor. And finally, the governor commuted his sentence. He was under a lot of pressure to do so. And Clyde Kennard died about 6 months later. So the title reflects what the state did and the drawn out process. They just didn't care. They took his life, basically, took his dreams away from him in the process, took his life. So I became fascinated with the story. I learned about it in June of 2017, and it took about 4 years to write the book and turn the manuscript in, and then spent another year or so cutting, editing, getting the galleys, proofing, doing the index and all of that. And so it was a almost 6 year project total. So
That's really fascinating. And I've wondered with all of you, when you write something like this, and I know they're all three a little bit different, but it seems like you would really connect with the topic that you're writing with, really connect with the people that you're writing about. And I would have to imagine that that affects your work in some way. Can anyone speak to that that point?
So do you mean connect with the characters in our book
Yes.
that we're writing about, Beth?
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes.
Yeah. So I'll start. This whole time I've been working on Mountain Meadows since 2006. I always felt a lot of compassion for the victims of this horrendous crime, and was very deeply affected by the horror of what was done to these innocent people. And so that eventually led me to actually fly out to Arkansas just of my own volition, and to meet the descendants of the victims, which was a very emotional experience. And being able to look at descendants of these 17 children who had been spared the crime, look at their descendants and tell them how sorry I was for what had happened to their ancestors was a very moving experience. So for me, writing this book has been a deeply, deeply personal experience.
I imagine. And Devery, what about for you? And Devery, your book is obviously out, and so I have it, and I've been reading it, and I'm not that far into it, but what I've read so far is very moving, and I I feel a connection, and I've always been interested in the civil rights movement. And but tell me about your experience, because it looks like you had to meet with family and people who knew Clyde Kennard, and just curious how that affected you.
Yes, I interviewed about 60 people. Some of those people knew him. Some came later, like Governor Haley Barbour in Mississippi. I interviewed him because he was one of those. He was asked to posthumously pardon Clyde Kennard, and he wouldn't do it. And so I interviewed him to talk more about that. So many of the people were familiar with the case, or I guess they all were familiar with the case, but only a handful really knew him. But that experience, just like with writing my Emmett Till book and interviewing family there, it just drew me in so much that the case wasn't strictly a historical event in my mind. Once I started, it became very personal because I started talking to these people that had a personal connection to it. And I guess for me, this whole interest in African American history that led me to write these two books really began with my interest in LDS history and the erstwhile policy of denying black men and women the temple and black men the priesthood. And having developed that interest and studied Lester Bush's article, I remember from Dialogue, and how liberating that felt to let go of that as a doctrine that I had to defend or somehow had to believe in and defend. And when that burden was lifted from me, right around the same time that Medgar Evers' killer was convicted finally 30 years after that murder, and that kind of reading about that in the newspapers, I wanted to learn more, and so I developed this interest in the general African American experience. And so began with Mormon history, and I think the connection we all had with that policy in our lives for so long. Those of us who were alive when it was in place, and the feelings we got when it ended, and it just kind of pushed me into that whole general experience and wanting to know more and write, and so it became a big passion for me as a result of that. I don't think it ever would have happened had I not began with LDS connection, for sure. I think I can say that pretty safely.
That's really interesting. Um, John, with your book, it's a little bit different and stuff, but what connection do you feel to, or what got you into that?
That was one of the most surprising things to me. I've written about the past, but I've always written about dead people. And so writing about living people was very different. And I felt this unexpected responsibility to be fair, um, to the point where I've gone through the manuscript so many times. Is this, I don't want to be fawning. I don't want to just be fanboying all over these people. I want to accurately explain what happened, but I do want to be fair. So I've tried to have a rule for myself where I've kind of said, would I say this to their face? If they were standing in front of me, would I write this or say this? And I've tried to let that guide me, because I was able to interview some of the cast. I was able to interview some family members of some deceased cast members, and I was able to just over email ask some questions of the director. And being able to do that, again, made the connection more real and did make it feel like, I think I'm also very sensitive to celebrity culture is really weird, right? We
Yeah.
talk about celebrities and famous people as if we know them, and we don't know them, and for these people, this is a job. This is a job, and making movies isn't just a job. It's often a very tedious job. There's a lot of standing around while we reset lighting or do this or do that. And on Clue, there's a story that fans love where Michael McKean, who played Mr. Green, he's a pretty well-known actor. He talks about how they would go to the billiard room and play pool in between scenes and in between shots. And I love that story, but what I try and get across is, because it can be really boring sitting around a sound stage and making a movie. And so I felt a lot of responsibility to these people to be accurate without falling down either side of I'm a big fan, or falling down the other side of basically being a tabloid kind of writer, and just telling stories that get people all riled up and stuff like that. I wanted to be fair to them, and I hope I've done that.
Well, that sounds good. I'm curious also with all of you, if when you're writing about these people and you're uncovering things that maybe don't look good, it's easy to villainize people. When you are writing about people that are being persecuted, and I'm thinking Barbara and Devery specifically right now, but John, you can chime in too. Do you walk away feeling like empathy for the persecutors at all, or do you not see that? I guess I'm thinking of like John D. Lee, and like in the case of Clyde Kennard, like some of the people who we've kind of villainized. How do you reconcile that?
Well, I think the craft of a historian is to try and show perspectives from various sources. Every source that you can find on a topic, you try and share those perspectives, and also try and share people's motivations. And in doing so, you don't have to condone what people did. You don't have to agree with their viewpoints, but you do try and just show the motivations. And so, for example, with the Mountain Meadows Massacre, you have to show that it took place in a context of war. In 1857, there was federal troops were headed towards Utah to occupy the territory. There was a feeling of fear throughout the territory about what the troops' intentions were and what this would mean. So there's all kinds of factors going on. And so showing those motivations is important, but you don't have to empathize with the murders or the horrible things that the actors did as a result of those motivations. And I mean, personally, yeah, when I step away from my work, I felt a lot of anger, incredible anger for the perpetrators of this crime, including I found out one of my ancestors who was one of the perpetrators. But when you're writing, it's important that you, just from a historian's perspective, is try and just share those motivations and so forth as dispassionately as possible.
I know for me, and again, yes, when you're a historian, you have to pull yourself out of it and show these. You have to examine everything and come up with conclusions, and they may not always be popular. Like, for example, two people in my book who are still living, that some people saw their role in this case, like with Haley Barbour, for example, governor of Mississippi. He's I think he hasn't been governor for several years now, but he was during this whole attempt to exonerate Clyde Kennard posthumously, and he'd been asked to pardon him because as a governor he could posthumously pardon. There was precedent for it that the president, Clinton as president, posthumously pardoned people. Other governors in other states had, but he refused to do it because he said he didn't have the authority to do it. And people tried to point out to him, well, it's been done elsewhere. Your powers as governor are the same in every state. And he wouldn't do it. And some people just felt that he was racist. And as I interviewed people, they said, several people said to me, oh, that Haley Barbour, I can't believe how racist he was. He wouldn't pardon him. Well, I interviewed him and I looked at other sources. And when they chose to do a different method to exonerate him, they actually took it back to the court. Circuit court that had convicted him in 1960, and that judge overturned it. Haley Barbour got on board and signed the petition for that. And he also built the only civil rights museum in the country that was built primarily with state funds. And so he authorized all that. He housed the Freedom Riders for an anniversary celebration at the governor's mansion. He pardoned a lot of people as governor who were of all races and felt they were no longer, if they were in a wheelchair, for example, he felt they couldn't do any damage, let them go home and live their lives. So putting everything together, I think he didn't have good reason for not pardoning Clyde Kennard, but I don't think he was racist in that way. I think I can point to so many other things he did that I think he could be proud of, racially. And the same with a Judge, Charles Pickering, who was a George W. Bush appointee for a federal judgeship. And at the time, the Democrat, and I'm a Democrat, but at the same time, I know that people play politics all the time. And so because he had done a couple things that people found questionable, the Democrats in the Senate blocked his appointment. President Bush finally appointed him on as a recess appointee, and then he finally retired because he didn't want to try to go through the confirmation process again at the end of the year. But he had a very good history of testifying against the Klan, and he received death threats. He was on the board for the Charles Winter Racial Reconciliation Institute in Mississippi. I was able to find enough good stuff about him, and he came on board and led the petition that finally exonerated Clyde Kennard. So, and I had a lot of people who kept telling me, oh, these two were racist, they were racist, blah, blah, blah. Treating them fairly, I'm going to have some people upset with me that I'm not on board with them to call them racist the way I guess I'm kind of half expected to. But I just couldn't do it. I had to be fair, and I had to look at their whole careers, and I just felt that it didn't justify that. And so some people will be upset, but I felt that I just had to, obviously when you're a historian, you have to be fair. You have to look at all the facts and reach a conclusion. I could have come in with an agenda to make all these white people look horrible, but that would have been wrong. So.
Right. That's interesting. And John, how about you? Do you have anything that relates to that?
My book's a little different, but I do think, one thing I'll say about that is I think regardless of who we're writing about, whether it's a celebrity who may at the time be popular, they may be unpopular, whether we're writing about a historical figure who killed people or historical figures who did things maybe we didn't like, I think we have to start with the fact that they are human and that humans are capable of great things and terrible things. And I think with the rise of social media in the last decade, we're kind of in this weird place where social media is great because it allows us to have a lot of conversations about stuff that maybe in the past we wouldn't have been able to have. Anybody can go online and share their opinion, and some of those opinions get a lot of traction, and that's a really good thing. Where in the past, the average person couldn't do that. You could maybe write a letter to the editor or something like that. So we're able to have these conversations, but then they end up getting flattened really quickly and really binary, and everybody on one side or the other. And someone's worst moment becomes who they are. And maybe in the case of John D. Lee, that's appropriate. But in most cases, I think it's not. And I don't think we can reckon appropriately with bad things that happen, even evil things, unless we acknowledge that even the worst people have these other sides to them. And no matter how big of a monster you might think someone is, there's someone out there who, a family member who's like, oh, they weren't that bad. And maybe they were, and it's not my place to say. But I do think that trying to make people one-dimensional, regardless of the circumstances, is never helpful, and especially doesn't work when you're trying to write about history.
Yeah, I agree with Devery and John. Studying history teaches us something, and that is like John was just saying, that there is the potential for good and bad in every human. Just as an example for me, I was a huge fan of Franklin D. Roosevelt my whole life and some of the things he did. And then for my master's thesis at the University of Utah, I chose to write about Japanese American internment policy, and I delved into his archives and discovered he did horrible, just his racist views and the things that he did to Japanese Americans was just appalling to me. And so I learned wow, here's this person that I loved for bringing us out of the Depression and all of the programs he started for the poor and so forth. But he also did these horrible things to Japanese Americans. And I feel another character I feel the same way about is Brigham Young. Sometimes some of the things he said and did, I'm just appalled by. Other times, some of the things he says and does just have really warmed my heart. So like Devery and John were saying, that study of history teaches us that people are complex, and to write about history and write about these characters in history, we have to be really nuanced.
I like that.
I'm glad Barbara mentioned that, because one of the characters in Clue is played by a woman named Kelly Nakahara, and she passed away in 2020, and I was able to interview her family. She's most famous for playing Nurse Kelly on MASH. She was in almost every episode, whether she had a line or not, or was credited or not. She's in almost every episode. She played the cook in Clue. When I was interviewing her family, I learned that her grandfather came to the United States from Japan. They lived in Hawaii, and he started a fishing business. After Pearl Harbor was bombed, he was rounded up and sent to an internment camp in New Mexico, and he died there, and the family never learned what happened to him.
Oh. Yeah,
that's just,
John, that made me think, and everyone talking made me think, and maybe this was something you would say, but what surprised you the most about doing the research and writing of your book? Like, finding something like that out would be pretty, that's very tragic. So I wonder, each of you, if you could address that a little bit. Barbara, you've been doing this research for so long, that I wonder if there are any surprises to you, but, all three of you, good or bad, were there any surprises as you were researching and writing your books?
I think anytime people do historical research and archival research, there's always surprises that you aren't expecting, that maybe changes the interpretation of a historical subject. So that's just part of the craft of history. And to me, that's what makes history so exciting and interesting. But for me, looking at what happened after the Mountain Meadows Massacre in our subsequent volume revealed a lot more about what happened before and the motivations beforehand. So one of the things that we looked at that was surprising to me was how many attacks, that other attacks on immigrant companies occurred after the Mountain Meadows Massacre throughout Utah Territory. And so then we started looking at all of the attacks, and there were several in between September 7th and October 3rd. And so we looked at, why are all these attacks happening? And digging deeper, we found out the motivation for what was driving those. And we discovered that the Mountain Meadows Massacre was just one of these planned immigrant or cattle raids that went awry. So we came up with a new interpretation in our second volume. So that's just one of the surprises.
Okay.
Encountered.
How about you, Devery? And then John?
There weren't really any surprises in things I learned about the case. I guess I was maybe surprised at some of the sources I was able to find to confirm things I had thought. I was able to interview. I guess I'm surprised at some of the people that I was able to interview, such as the former governor and former federal judge. They were so willing, but also the person whose testimony in court framed Clyde Kennard. He talked to me, and
Wow.
He's since passed away. But and even the prison doctor who first diagnosed Clyde Kennard with colon cancer in 1960, I found him and interviewed him, and they were all willing. And I was just surprised by the living sources I was able to get my hands on and talk to and answer questions that only they could have ever answered for me. And so I was just amazed by that. And so that's where my surprises came in, really, the sources, living sources, and that, they're not going to be around a lot longer. One's already died. And so writing the book when I did I had great timing on this.
For sure. Sounds like. John, how about you?
My surprise was, I mean, certainly I found things that were surprising to me that were kind of specific to the movie and how it was made. But the biggest surprise, I think, was I think we all tend to, at least I do, I tend to think that if something happened in my lifetime, by virtue of me being alive for it, makes it modern and recent. And I saw this movie in theaters, right? It came out in 1985. And I just thought, oh, everything's, video, whatever I need is going to be available. And I'm really shocked. And I don't think I won't get on my film preservation high horse, but I do think people would be surprised at how much is gone, or at least is difficult to find. One example is I was looking for footage of some of the actors on Late Night with David Letterman. And I mean, I watched Letterman faithfully. I was a huge fan. I loved Letterman growing up. And so I watched the show all the time. And I thought, surely this is just a YouTube click away. You can hardly find anything available from David Letterman. And I finally found someone who is the foremost archiver of David Letterman's show. And he's just a guy. It's not UCLA Film Archive. It's not the Paley Center. They have a lot of stuff, but the person who has the most is just a nice guy who feels like it's his responsibility to archive this stuff for future generations. And I think, like all history, I don't think people appreciate how quickly stuff can fade away, and what the effort it takes to properly care for the past and for documentation. And that's especially true when we start getting into videotape and celluloid and film and that kind of thing. It can vanish really, really quickly.
That's really interesting.
Beth, talking about how you weren't thinking of this as history, John, but actually it is history. I'll bet some of our listeners don't even know who David Letterman is. Some of our younger listeners. Crazy.
Wow.
You all work for Signature Books. I guess this is a twofold question. One is, all of these books are published with someone other than Signature Books, obviously. And maybe you could speak to that a little bit. And then the second question is, how has your writing on these books informed your work with Signature Books on titles and authors that you're currently working with? And I'll start with Devery on that one.
And the first part of the question, I'm sorry, could you just repeat the first one?
Sure. So the first part is, all three of you have these great books that are coming out, or yours has come out, and they're not published through Signature Books. So could you maybe explain to our listeners why your book is not published through Signature Books?
Yes. Well, in my case, the book has no content on Mormonism, Utah, or the West. And so it wouldn't have been something that Signature really could have published without deviating from what we're known to publish and what our readers would expect. And so, although I think had Signature published it, it would have been beautifully edited, beautifully designed, and I would have loved it, the look of it, but it just wasn't appropriate for Signature, or at least not, don't want to use the word appropriate because it sounds like it's a bad book or something, but it's
not in our wheelhouse.
Just not in our wheelhouse. So
that makes sense. Okay.
And I think that's the same with John as well. Yeah. Maybe we could all answer the first question, Beth, and then
go to the first question first. Go ahead.
I'm similar. I mean, my book is definitely outside of Signature's wheelhouse. Nothing really about the LDS Church, the American West, or anything like that. The one tiny exception is my first chapter is a very broad overview, and I mean very broad overview of the history of murder mysteries. So I go into Agatha Christie and Sherlock Holmes, and I always love to take the opportunity, if I can, to tell people that Sherlock Holmes got his start in an anti-Mormon novel called A Study in Scarlet. And so that was fun to talk about, that connection. But beyond that, it isn't the kind of thing that Signature would publish. So I have a great publisher that specializes in pop culture history. It's a perfect fit, and so it's gone really well.
Great. And how about you, Barbara?
Yeah, so obviously mine, a book on the Mountain Meadows Massacre does fall into all three categories. It's about Mormon history, it's about Utah history, and it's about Western American history. But we signed the contract for this book back in 2009 with Oxford University Press, long before I started working with Signature. So,
and also they had done the first one.
Yeah, Oxford published our first book that came out in 2008. Yeah.
Okay, and so that's pretty normal for them to be in the sequel then. Okay, that sounds good. And then the second part of that question is, how has working on those books informed your work at Signature with whatever, position you're in, since each one of you is in a different position?
Yeah. So in my case, the first book, I was the content editor for that book. And so I got to have the experience of being on the editing side. I had had a lot of experience in editing before that as well. But so working with authors on the editing side for the first book on the Mountain Meadows Massacre, and then the second book working as an author, it's allowed me to see things, the whole editing process, design process from both sides. And so I feel like that helps me in my work with authors at Signature as well.
Definitely. John, how about you?
For me, it's been really useful to go through the editing process with another editor. I'm an editor at Signature. And so, but we do a pretty specific thing here, right? It's LDS history, certainly not all 19th century history, but tends to lean towards 19th century history. And it's really easy, right, to kind of get in a groove with that. And that can be helpful, but it's also really nice to be reminded that there's a lot more out there. My editor at my publishing company was an editor for Variety magazine, the industry trade, for a really long time. And his experience is just so different than mine. And that has been incredibly helpful to me to go through his edits for me, and to see what he calls out, stuff that obviously, I either missed or didn't think about. He'll call this stuff out, and it does give me pause. And while all of it might not be relevant to what we do at Signature, it's still really helpful to be reminded. I mean, editing is a huge, huge world. And I think it's really easy to get caught up in what we do on a daily basis without reflecting on that. And so I've really enjoyed actually being kind of knocked out of that frame of mind, and to have to think, oh, okay, so there's a lot of different stuff going on, again, with more modern events as well, and being able to reflect on that.
Great.
And I think for me, it's interesting. To be on this end of it, with a publisher where I'm talking to their marketing people and they're sending me things to fill out and do, and as opposed to what I do here, where I'm on the other end of that. But the University Press of Mississippi, they do the publishing for all 8 public universities in Mississippi. So because each university doesn't have its own press and they do it for all 8, they publish about 80 books a year. And although they don't have a huge staff, they have several people, I think, in marketing, because I get contacted by different people all the time. And just being on that end of it, and with these people that have this, background, it's given me some ideas. Like when they sent out the author questionnaire, when they've arranged signings and asked me certain questions, I've thought about some of that and how are these things we can implement. Some of it's stuff we already implemented, but just kind of gave me ideas to fine tune certain things. And I think it's good to be on this end of it, as to learn and have to work for another publisher to try to be, because I know when we send things out to authors, we like to get the stuff back quickly. We have deadlines, And so for me to drag my feet, I can't really do that if I don't want someone doing that to me. And so all these things have taught me about efficiency a little more, or confirm things that, yeah, that does work because that's how we do it type thing. And so that's been fun, and it's been enlightening for me. So, and I noticed that with the first book too, I did 8 years ago, and I was editing with Signature back then. And so seeing their process to edit a book and the steps to do it and to do it more efficiently was just really an eye opener for me. So
That's good. What is it for each of you about your stories that has, that's different? What is it about the story that you've written that's different than other stories that are out there? And how do you keep going writing a story like you've written these histories? I guess, how do you keep going and have the energy or enthusiasm when you've been working on it so long to move that story forward?
Well, for me, what drove me on in spite of writing like a horrifically depressing story, was doing it for the victims. I thought, these people are gone. There's nothing we can do for them now other than make sure that their story is told. And working on these books has also eventually led to achieving National Historic Landmark status for the Mountain Meadows, where their remains still lay. And so those are the two things I've realized I can continue to do for the victims of this atrocity. And so that has been what's driven me on, in spite of the fact that sometimes I was having PTSD symptoms initially just because of the horrific nature of what I was writing about. And so that's been something that I felt good about that I can do for those people. So that's been very meaningful for me.
Thank you, Barbara.
I think for me, the story, what makes a story different is that, there are a lot of stories about atrocities in Mississippi during the Civil Rights Movement. Clyde Kennard never got to attend school, the school of his choice, and he dies at age 36 from colon cancer. But and that's the sad ending of the book. The last 3 chapters of the book was about the effort to exonerate him posthumously. And in the end, it turned out to be a very healing thing for Mississippi, because Black and white, liberal and conservative people all came together with this common goal to get that conviction overturned. And they faced a lot of obstacles, but they did so, and they got it done. And that was a healing thing for Mississippi. Clyde was gone, but it was healing for Mississippi to be able to come together and do that. So I think in that sense, this book is different than a lot of those cases, because people felt the pain of Kennard's death and the way he was treated, but they did what they could to put some type of closure for them, and for them to be able to just to heal, which they desperately needed to do. So I think it's a bit different in that way. I also, as far as the contribution, towards the end of the book, I quote from a rabbi friend of Clyde Kennard's who wrote a letter to Clyde's mother after his death, to console her, and he said, one day when the books, or when the story of Mississippi civil rights is told, your son Clyde will be high on the list of martyrs for that. And I feel that by doing the book, I'm at least helping that to fulfill that. And that's what I'm hoping to see happen in time. I'm hoping enough people will read it. It'll be in libraries, and it will be out there enough to where his name becomes a little more familiar to everybody. So, and that was what really drove me to write it. When I saw that he was exonerated, and the process that it took, and how so many people came together to do it, I thought, wow, I can write a very sad story with a somewhat happy ending. And so that I was really driven to do that. And I thought that was such an important part of the story to be able to tell, so that it wasn't just all depressing. So
I like that, Devery and Barbara. And John, I'll turn some time to you.
Yeah, I think pop culture is very important, and that compels me because my generation and these movies that came out in the 1980s, obviously there have been movies for a century. People have loved movies. There have been movie fans, but it wasn't until then, it wasn't really until the 1980s that people felt a stronger personal connection to films through the process of watching them over and over again, because we have home video now, right? We have cable TV where, and remember in 1986, 1987, there's 40 channels. Now we have like 20,000 channels. There's 40 channels. And I remember as a kid, even having memorized what channel, which channel was on which which network was on the right channel. And so HBO was this and Showtime was this, and you could jump around and see this stuff. So I see my book as really more about nostalgia than anything else. Sure, it's definitely about the making of the movie, and I hope fans of the movie, find out and learn everything they've ever wanted to know, more than they've ever wanted to know. But I think it's easy to be dismissive of this kind of stuff, but there's a whole generation of kids that were like me that didn't really care about sports, that didn't really care about all this other stuff that previous generations had cared about. We wanted to get home from school. We were the latchkey generation, and we wanted to watch TV and we wanted to watch movies. We wanted to watch Saturday Night Live. We wanted to watch David Letterman. And it really forged a lot of friendships for a lot of people. And these things, as silly as a lot of these movies like Clue or Ghostbusters or The Goonies or whatever are, they came to mean a lot to a lot of people. And so I want to honor that. And that's what compels me to tell these stories.
Well, I love all of your answers. And I think these are such interesting, three such very different and interesting books. I want to kind of wrap things up a little bit in kind of wrapping up here. What do you hope the readers of your books will take away from your words? Barbara, can we start with you?
I hope that readers of our book about the Mountain Meadows Massacre will come away recognizing the dangers of extremism, the dangers of thinking in us and them terms, the dangers in violence, and not just see this as a tragic story that happened in the 19th century, but see some parallels, some things that are going on today in our world, and learn from the past so that we can avoid some of those same pitfalls and make a difference today.
John or Devery?
I think most of all, I just want people who love this movie to learn a lot and to have fun. It was a fun book to write, and I hope it's a fun book to read. That's really what I want. I also hope people, again, like I just said previously, I hope people get a sense of their childhood out of it and some nostalgia out of it. And I hope they learn something about how movies are made. I do try and have asides throughout the book that this is how movies in 1985 were made. This is what it was like to be on a soundstage. This is what it was like for the actors to come in the morning for hair and makeup. And this is how special effects worked at the time before, computer digital effects were widespread. This is how dailies worked and that kind of thing. I hope people who otherwise maybe haven't read a lot about how movies are made learn something about how movies are made. I think it's important.
Great. Devery?
Well, one of the things that stands out in the book, I think, is just how people, in the context of segregation back in the day and the fight to maintain it at all costs, how people can easily be led to defend the indefensible
Right.
For decades and for years, and how much more how easy it is to do that when you've got state officials doing it for you that you look up to, which is what happened here. From the governor on down, people went after Clyde Kennard to keep him from integrating that school, to the point where they, with free of conscience, framed him and put him away, and were fined to let him just stay there. And so defending the indefensible, I think, is what people need to understand, because it happens today. And in talking about how polarized we are today because of that, it's nice to be able to see that people with different views and different politics, different races came together, like I mentioned earlier, in the end, and exonerated him as a group. Young people, old people, students, older people, black, white, liberal, and conservative. And people can work together for something good if they really want to. And sometimes people get moved to do that. We just need to be moved to do that much more than we are. But I think it starts with getting rid of that need to defend the indefensible. And we just need to come together by laying that kind of thing aside. And we can do a lot of good as people if we can come together. And I think this book kind of highlights all of that. And it's one of the things I'm proud of about it.
That's great. I think my final question, and you're welcome to chime in or say anything if you'd like to add anything. And you've kind of all spoken to this a little bit, but was there a reward to you in writing your book that you didn't see coming from the beginning to now where you are at the end? And I'm not talking a financial reward, because we all know that anyone who writes historical books has taken a vow of poverty. Is there a reward that, maybe for you personally, or that you've seen in meeting with the people that you've talked to and researching it? Does anything come to mind?
So for me, when I was hired, I was really excited to be hired to edit this book project, because I had heard about the Mountain Meadows Massacre, and I was just very curious. I really wanted to know, how could this happen? How did this happen? So I was so excited to learn about that, and that was basically, my reason for my interest. And so what was surprising for me, I kind of mentioned it before, but eventually it led me to these friendships and these relationships with descendants of the victims. Most of these friends live in Arkansas, Oklahoma, Texas, that cultural region still. And some of them have become some of my dearest friends. And I have had some very, very sweet and tender and moving memories with them. And so I think for me, that's been the biggest emotional benefit to this by far.
Yeah, I would say the friendships I made as a result of this, some that stand out. There was a family, the Damer family in Hattiesburg, Mississippi. Vernon Damer was a civil rights leader who was his house was firebombed by the Ku Klux Klan in the middle of the night in 1966, and he was killed. His wife was burned. His daughter was burned badly, and his sons who were there managed to escape. But the widow's still living. I interviewed her for my book. She still lives on the same property that was firebombed all those years ago. Her son, Dennis, has become a good friend. The judge who exonerated Clyde Kennard has become a friend. Some of those students who fought to exonerate Clyde Kennard back in 2006, who are now in their mid-30s, they become good friends. And it's satisfying to me to be able to highlight their stories in this book. Their stories hadn't been told except in some newspaper articles, and now it's going to be preserved as part of the process that got him exonerated. So to bring out some of these people who were otherwise obscure and to have them in the book that people can read about has been very satisfying. The friendships I made And both books on Mississippi history that I've done have resulted in lots of friends now that I never would have had, never would have known. And so I'll always be grateful for that.
That's great. How about you, John?
For me, it's been seeing just how much fun fans have learning about the movie. I advertise a lot of stuff on Instagram. I have an account there just to kind of promote the book, and I didn't really know what would come of that. It's just the response from people when I show them something that they didn't know is really gratifying. Um, there are a lot of people who love this movie and love similar movies, and being able to share stuff about it and see their excitement is one of my favorite things. And also, yeah, meeting people. I was able to be interviewed for a documentary on the making of the movie, and the director is just a wonderful person, and it's been really fun to get to know him and some of the other people involved. And it always seems to come down to that, right? The personal connections that these things make. And so I've been really grateful for that.
Yeah, when I'm listening to all of you, and I hope our listeners will hear that too. I think that's the root of everything that you are doing, is having that personal connection at the end of the day. That sounds like what is compelling to each of you. And I want to thank each of you for your time today on our podcast, starting with Barbara Jones Brown. And again, her book is coming out in May of this year, 2023, Vengeance is Mine, the Mountain Meadows Massacre and its Aftermath. John Hatch, his book is What Do You Mean Murder, which is a line from the movie. And that is coming out on November 7th of 2023. And then Devery Anderson, and his book is The Story of Clyde. I'm sorry, let me start over. Slow, Calculated Lynching, The Story of Clyde Kennard. And that is out. And I want to thank each of you for being on today, for your time and for your research and your efforts in bringing these books out to everyone. And we're grateful that we could interview and talk with you today. And I hope our listeners will enjoy this as well.
Thanks, Beth.
All
And
right.
I think I could speak for all of us when I say that as exciting as it is to publish our own books, it's also really exciting to help other authors bring their works to life and help to publish their research and their stories as well. So it's a great industry to be in.
Well, and I think that comes through. And I think because of your backgrounds, each of you are very gifted and talented in your areas of expertise. And I feel lucky that I get to watch that and see that behind the scenes here. So this has been a
All right.
Signature Books broadcast, and we're excited to have you listening. And we'd like to invite you to look at our show notes for any information about our authors.